All right, so this is the start of chapter 15. So chapter 15 is on human development. It says the process of human development and birth inspires awe and wonder in both scientists and non-scientists alike. Over a period of about 38 weeks, 266 days, a fertilized egg cell undergoes a staggeringly complex sequence of changes as it multiplies, modifies, develops, and grows to form the hundreds of billions of cells that make up the tissues, organs, and systems of the infant human body. So within 38 weeks or 266 days, something goes from being one cell to billions of cells, which make up a baby. This is the vocabulary for this section. This is a little bit of a vocabulary heavy section. But I'll explain what all these things mean as we go along. So this is the 15.1 video. This is talking about fertilization and embryonic development. So it says biologists commonly divide prenatal or pre-birth development into three 3-month periods called trimesters. So in total, you're pregnant for 9 months. So every 3 months is a different trimester. Biologists also use a complementary system to organize and describe developmental events before birth. This system uses 2 main periods of prenatal development. The embryonic period of development, which is the first 8 weeks, or first 2/3 of the first trimester of pregnancy. And during this time, tremendous change takes place. Cells divide and become redistributed. Tissues and organs form, and structures that support and nourish the developing embryo also form. So within that first 2/3 of the first trimester, so like the first 2 months, I guess, is known as the embryonic period. And that's a huge part of development because that's when you go from a cell to an embryo. And then the other part is the fetal period, and this is from the start of the 9th week through to birth. So a lot longer of a period of time. But during this fetal period, this is when the body grows rapidly and organs begin to function and coordinate to form organs. So in the very first 8 weeks, you're going to basically be focusing on going from a cell to an embryo, and then from 9 weeks to birth, that's when all of our organs are start to be created, as well as start to form and move to the right parts of the body. If we look at this sort of diagram, this is going to sort of show you this whole stages that we're going through. So a sperm's journey. A sperm enters through the vagina, in through the cervix, up through the fallopian tube or oviduct, where it's going to meet the egg. The egg is going to become fertilized in the fallopian tube, and then as it gets fertilized, or what's happening when it fertilizes, I guess, is the sperm or a bunch of sperm will swarm the egg. Then the head of only one of the sperm will enter the egg. So whichever one makes it there first and enters the egg, that's going to be the one that fertilizes. A new membrane forms to prevent further entry of sperm. So there's sort of like this wall that will protect it from other sperm entering. And then fertilization will occur. So human development begins with fertilization. This involves the joining of a female and male gametes, called the sperm and the egg, to form a single cell that contains 23 chromosomes from each parent. So remember, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, so those make up 46. So we're only gathering half of our parents' chromosomes. So that's why we don't look like exact copies of our parents, because we only have half of their genetics. Several events lead up to the moment of fertilization or conception. In the female body, an egg is released from the ovary and swept into the oviduct. The egg is carried towards the uterus by muscle contractions and the wave-like actions of the cilia, which line the oviduct. The passage of the egg is slow, and it takes about 4 days to reach the uterus. It must be fertilized within 12 to 24 hours of its release, or it will lose its capacity to develop further. Several 100 million sperm cells exit the male's urethra during ejaculation. Once they enter the female's vagina, they must make their way to the cervix, then through the uterus, and finally to the oviduct into which the egg was released. Most sperm do not survive this journey, and many are destroyed by the naturally acidic environment of the vagina. Others go the wrong way. The sperm enters the oviduct that does not have the egg. So if I go back to this picture, only one of these oviducts is going to have an egg. Each month, this one will release, then the next month, this one will release. Some of these sperm might start going this way. Oh, and they're not going to meet an egg. So it's just the luck of the draw, 50-50 chance whether they're going the right way. From the millions of sperm released, only a few dozen to a few hundred survive to reach the egg. The plasma membrane of the egg is surrounded by a thin, clear layer of protein and carbohydrates. This layer is surrounded by several jelly-like layers called follicle cells that loosely adhere to one another. So basically, around the egg, there's a really thin coating of protein that the sperm has to make its way through. These cells, or this membrane, is there as a source of nourishment for the egg when it was in the ovarian follicle. So when it was developing, this little membrane was there to give nourishment or food to the egg while it was developing. When a sperm meets the corona radiata. So if we look back, that's one of the layers of the follicle. The sperm's enzyme containing acrosome, or the cap of the sperm, releases its contents. So its contents is an enzyme that will digest a path through the corona and zona pellucida. So these are those layers around the egg. So I'm going back to this picture again. So if this is their egg, there's going to be these little layers. Oh. So you see how there's like a red layer, a black layer, a white layer, and then inside is the blue. Think of each of these colors as a layer that the sperm is going to have to make its way through. The sperm advances farther by means of lashing action of its tail. The action of hundreds of sperm may be necessary to clear a path from the one sperm that is able to successfully enter the egg. So lots of sperm, they're all working together to get at least one of them into the egg. They're all sort of like, that's their purpose in life, is to be able to help get one of their brothers to the egg. Once a sperm enters the egg's plasma membrane depolarizes, preventing other sperm. So that's what it shows back here, is that there's a new membrane that forms, which stops any other sperm from getting in. Within 12 hours of the sperm's nucleus, within 12 hours of the sperm's nucleus enters the egg, the membrane of the sperm nucleus and the egg nucleus disappear. So within 12 hours of the sperm and egg coming together, their nuclei, I guess you should say, disappear. 23 chromosomes in the ovum are joined with the 23 in the sperm. Those are, remember, in the nucleus of a cell. That's where the chromosomes are. So the nucleus will disappear and these 23 chromosomes will join together. Fertilization is now complete. So once these 23 chromosomes bind together, they have now created a new cell, which we call a zygote. So this is a single cell which will then start to divide to become a person. So this is a picture of it. Maybe this is a little, I may come back to this one, but basically we already know from the last chapter how the ovary releases the egg down the oviduct. What happens in that time we haven't really looked at. So this is sort of going in a more in-depth way of how this is happening. So fertilization, one sperm gets into the egg, a lot of them are trying, and then once the sperm has mated or once it's been fertilized, then it's going to start going into these dividing stages, which we'll talk about in a second. I'll go back to that picture. So once the egg is fertilized, it's still moving through the oviduct and is several days away from entering the uterus. Within 30 hours of being fertilized, the 0.1 millimeter zygote divides by mitosis for the first time, giving rise to 2 new cells. So just within 30 hours, there's now 2 new cells. So if we look at that, this would be the stage 2. So 1 cell becomes 2 cells. These cells also divide, forming 4 cells. The 4 cells will divide to create 8 cells, and so on. So 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells, 16 cells. So it's just going to continue to keep dividing and dividing and dividing. They're basically breaking apart and making exact copies of each other. This is what we learned about in mitosis. So I don't remember, you did that in grade 11, hopefully. That's what mitosis is. So the overall size of the zygote remains to be about 1.1 millimeter. So each cell becomes smaller and smaller as it divides. But overall, the zygote is 0.1 millimeter. So it's just breaking into smaller and smaller pieces of itself, but altogether is still keeping the same size. This process of cell division without enlargement of the cell is called the cleavage. So if we go back here, that's that cleavage part. Cleavage. By the time the zygote is a sphere of 16 cells, it's called a morula. A morula reaches the uterus within 3 to 5 days after fertilization. So cleavage stage, and then it's getting to the uterus, and it's now called a morula. Okay, so the morula makes it to the uterus. It begins to fill with fluid that diffuses from the uterus, and as the fluid-filled space develops, 2 different groups of cells form. The entire spherical structure is now called a blastocyte. The blastocyst, not cyst, cyst, is a hollow structure or a pouch from which new cellular structures can develop. One group of cells is called a trophoblast, which forms the outer layer of the blastocyst. It will develop into a membrane called a chorion. So let's go back to this picture. So the morula makes it to the uterus. Once it makes it to the uterus, it creates this thing, a blastocyst. So a blastocyst is basically all of the little cells, the morula. They sort of move to one side, leaving a big empty space. This blue part around is called the trophoblast. You see that in the next picture, which I've now got something over it. So that blue part is known as the trophoblast, and then inside this whole thing is called the blastocyst. That's the big empty space inside, and this is our cells that are still going to divide. So think of this as sort of like the pouch that's protecting you as you start to grow. Sort of like you're inside of an egg. So that whole thing is now called a chorion, and the chorion will develop to form part of the placenta. The placenta is a structure that provides nutrients and oxygen to and removes waste from the developing fetus or offspring. The other group of cells come together within the blastocyst to form the inner cell mass called the embryoblast. The inner cell mass develops into the embryo itself. Between the 5th and 7th day after fertilization, the blastocyst attaches to the endometrium, which is the lining of the inside of your uterus, and with the inner cell mass positioned against the endometrium. The trophoblast cell secretes enzymes that digest some of the tissue and blood vessels of the endometrium, and the blastocyst slowly sinks into the uterine wall. So all what's happening here, we've got fertilization, the cleavage stage where it just keeps breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. Once it gets to the uterus, they call it the morula. The morula will then start to create a blastocyst. A blastocyst is sort of when the cells move to one side, this big empty space, and then the trophoblast around. This trophoblast is going to protect the inside. Right in here is the chorion, and that is what is going to start to, see right on the side there where it's going against the uterus wall or into the endometrium. That's where it sinks in. And this little part is going to become the placenta. So those first parts are going to become the placenta, and the placenta is what's going to help to bring nutrients to the baby as it grows. And then this rest empty cavity is where the body is going to start to develop, where the rest of the fetus is going to develop. So the nestling of the blastocyst into the endometrium is called implantation. So that's when it's implanted in the wall, and that happens within 5 to 7 days from fertilization. This is complete within or by the 10th to 14th day. So implantation doesn't happen between 10 to 14 days. With successful implantation, the woman is said to be pregnant. Around the time the implantation begins, the trophoblast starts to secrete a hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This has the same effects of LH, so this maintains the corpus luteum past the time when it would otherwise degenerate. So remember back to chapter 14, you go through your menstrual cycle, in which at the very end of the menstrual cycle is when the corpus luteum would start to degenerate, and then you would have your period. Well, if you're pregnant, you don't want your uterus to release its lining, so instead of doing that, it's going to keep the corpus luteum in the uterus, or keep it from degenerating, which is going to keep you from having a period. So that's why people often know that they're pregnant if their menstrual cycle is off. They're not menstruating at their usual time. That's a really good sign that you are pregnant. The secretion of estrogen and progesterone continues, and it maintains the endometrium, preventing menstruation. The secretion of the HCG, or the human chorionic gonadotropin, continues at high levels for about 2 months. Then it declines to a lower level by the end of 4 months. So it's really important at the very first stages. Remember, that's your, now I can't even remember. What is that stage called? That's right at the very first. The embryonic stage. So that embryonic stage, which is those first 2 months, it's really important that the HCG, which is that hormone, is keeping it at a really high level so that your embryo can develop. Then it can sort of die off because that's going into a different stage, which is more on looking at fetal development. The corpus luteum remains intact throughout the pregnancy, and its functions as a source of hormones is less important after the first trimester. The placenta secretes sufficient estrogen and progesterone to maintain the endometrium. So corpus luteum, really important at the first 2 months. After that, it'll sort of die off. Not really that important because the placenta will be developed enough that it can keep the estrogen and progesterone levels high enough that you won't have a menstrual cycle, which would cause you to lose your baby. So really important that the placenta is keeping those estrogen and progesterone at a high enough level. During the second week, the blastocyst continues and completes the process of implantation. The inner cell mass changes. A space begins to form between the inner cell mass and the trophoblast. This space, called the amniotic cavity, will soon fill with liquid and is the place where the baby will develop. So remember, it's the pouch, that pouch or that area, the open space in my picture. This is going to become the amniotic cavity, and that's going to become filled with fluid called amniotic fluid. As the amniotic cavity forms, the inner cell mass flattens into a disc-shaped structure called the embryonic disc. This is supported by a short stalk that connects the blastocyst with the endometrium. So this is keeping the blastocyst connected to the endometrium. At first, the embryonic disc consists of 2 layers, an outer ectoderm, which is closer to the amniotic cavity, and then an inner endoderm, and then shortly after, a third layer called the mesoderm forms between the endo and ectoderm. The process of forming these 3 layers is called gastrulation, and these 3 layers are called the primary germ layers. So inside of this cavity, is where these 3 layers are going to start developing. So ecto will be on the outside, meso, middle, and endo on the inside. And those are the primary germ layers. Them being created is called gastrulation. The developing embryo is now called a gastrula. Gastrulation marks the start of the morphogenesis, the series of events that form distinct structures of the developing organism. So basically, creating these layers, those are going to become the layers of the body. So ecto is the outside. That's going to be more creating like the skin. Endo, inside. That's going to be like the sort of like the lining of your insides, so that the layer that covers all your organs. And then the meso would be that middle part that's going to be the organs, the stuff that's inside of your body. Morphogenesis depends on the ability of early embryonic cells to become different types of cells. So early cells need to start to differentiate. So that means if we look at our body, all the cells aren't the same. Remember when we looked at cells under a microscope? Whenever we did that, like an onion or a cheek cell, those cells look a whole lot different than, for instance, a nerve cell. I remember when we looked at neurons at the first of this class. So these cells were once one cell, but they're going to start to have certain functions and start to look a little bit different. Differentiation is the cellular process that enables the cell to develop a particular shape and to perform specific functions that are different from the functions of other cells. The development of the 3 primary germ layers is especially important because all the cells, tissues, and organs of the body are derived from the 3 primary germ layers throughout differentiation. So they need to develop and create different things so that they can create all of the parts of our body, the cells, the tissues, the organs that make up our body. Neurulation and organ formation. So between the 3rd and 8th weeks, the organs will start to form. With each passing day, the different rates of cell division in the primary germ layers cause tissues to fold into distinct patterns. The 3-layered embryo is transformed into a body with separate organs, and by about 8th week, a shape that is recognizably human. During the 3rd week, a thickened band of mesoderm cells develops along the back of the embryonic disc. These cells lie along what will become the baby's back and come together to form a rod-like structure called the notochord. If you remember back to Bio 20, we talked about, I made you guys do those little booklets, I believe, when we talked about the different sort of structures or different classifications. We talked about like kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. And one of them is notochord, I think is a phylum, or having a notochord, and that means having a backbone. So this notochord will actually form what we know of as a skeleton or our backbone, our vertebrae. The nervous system develops from the ectoderm that is located just above the notochord. So that's going to start to create our spine right inside of our skeleton. First, the cells along the surface above the notochord begin to thicken. Folds develop on each side of a groove along the surface, and when the folds fuse, they become a tube. And this develops into your brain and spinal cord. They call that the neural tube. The process of forming this tube is called neurulation, can't speak, and marks the start of organ formation. Soon after neurulation begins, a reddish bulge that contains the heart forms. So our very first, if we think about it, the very first body system to be created is the nervous system. And once our nervous system happens through neurulation, that will start to create your heart. So that circulatory system will exist. So if we look at this, that's after 8 weeks. So we're almost into the second trimester before we even get a heartbeat. So people are going to know that they're pregnant long before a heartbeat happens. Close to the 18th day, the heart will start beating. So you're 18 days after you become pregnant, the heart will start to beat. This is about the 4th week of prenatal development, and on is a time of rapid growth and differentiation. So after your first month, blood cells start to form and fill developing blood vessels. Lungs and kidneys take shape. Small buds, arms, and legs will appear. A distinct head is visible, with early evidence of eyes, ears, and nose. The embryo is about 0.6 centimeters long at this point. During the 5th week, the embryo's head is very large compared to its body. The eyes open, but do not yet have eyelids or irises. Cells in the brain are differentiating very quickly, and the embryo is about 1.3 centimeters long. In the 6th week, the brain continues its rapid development. The limbs lengthen and flex slightly. The gonads are starting to produce hormones that will influence the development of the external genitalia. During the 7th and 8th week, the embryo has distinct human characteristics. So you're not going to see it really look like a human until about 8 weeks into its development. The organs are formed, the nervous system is starting to coordinate body activity, and a skeleton of cartilage has formed. Eyes are well developed, but the lids are now closed, stuck together to protect them against random movements of fingers from the still elongating arms. So once the eyes are developed, the eyelids are going to close over top, and the baby will keep their eyes closed basically until they're born, because that's a way to protect their eyes. The nostrils are developed and are plugged with mucus. The external genitalia is still forming, and they're undifferentiated, so the physical sex of the embryo is still not apparent, even though the genetic sex has already been determined. So remember, right at fertilization, that's when it's going to decide whether you are male or female, but by looking at the embryo, you still, at this stage, can't figure out whether you're male or female. By the end of the 8th week of prenatal development, the embryo is about the size of a paperclip. So 8 weeks in, you've already got a nervous system and you're only the size of a paperclip. Approximately 90% of the organs and other structures that make up the adult human are established. So just by 8 weeks in, you have already fully developed to the size of a paperclip. And as the organs enlarge and mature until birth, the developing life is called a fetus. The internal organs of the embryo from between the 3rd and 8th week are formed during these weeks. At this time, an intricate system of membranes that are external to the embryo are also forming. The extra embryonic membranes called the alanatose, the amnion, the chorion, and the yolk sac. The extra embryonic membranes, along with the placenta and the umbilical cord that develop from the sum of them, are responsible for protection, nutrition, respiration, and excretion of the embryo. So all of these extra membranes, protective layers, are there to help the embryo. During birth, these membranes, including the placenta and the umbilical cord, are expelled from the uterus. So when you give birth to a baby, and then you give birth to all of these extra membranes. So you give birth to the placenta, and you would also, I guess they cut the umbilical cord that's attached to the baby, and then all of these extra membranes would be expelled from the uterus right after the baby is born. They're commonly known as the afterbirth. So you give birth to a baby, yeah, yay, it's crying, yay. And then the mother will actually go into labor again and have to push out the rest of the placenta and membranes. By the end of the 2nd week after fertilization, finger-like projections from the chorion extend into the uterine lining. These projections, known as chorionic villi, establish the beginning of the placenta. So this is just going over how the placenta is created. The placenta is a disc-shaped organ that is rich in blood vessels. The embryo is attached to the uterine wall by the placenta, and the metabolic exchange occurs through it. So that means that you're getting nutrition and metabolism from your mother. The placenta is fully developed by 10 weeks with a mass about 600 grams. One part of the placenta, the chorion tissue, comes from the embryo. The other part consists of blood pools from the mother's circulatory system. So the placenta is made up of part of the mother and part of the baby, and that is sort of where that exchange occurs. The blood systems of the mother and embryo are separate, but they lie very close to each other. So they have separate vessels, but they're very close to one another. This proximity permits nutrients and oxygen to diffuse from the mother's circulatory system to the developing baby, and for waste to leave the baby's circulation and enter the mother's for excretion. The placenta does not filter out substances such as alcohol, drugs, and nicotine, which can diffuse across the membranes. If these substances are present in the mother's blood, they will diffuse into the developing baby's blood. Exposure to these substances while pregnant can have severe negative effects on the embryo. So alcohol, drugs, nicotine, all not good for a developing fetus. Near the end of the 8 weeks, the yolk sac shrinks and the amniotic sac enlarges and the umbilical cord forms. The umbilical cord is a rope-like structure that averages about 60 centimeters long and about 2 centimeters in diameter. It leads from the navel area of the fetus to the center of the placenta. The umbilical cord contains 2 arteries which transport oxygen-depleted blood from the fetus to the placenta. So the artery will take all of the blood away from the baby to the mother. It also contains 1 vein which brings oxygen-rich blood to the fetus. The umbilical cord has natural twists since the umbilical vein is longer than the arteries are. Wow, so that is that whole section. That's 15.1. And we will go on to 15.2 soon in my next video. Thanks so much.